forget, or they're untold because we lose those people. So, in a somber moment recently, I've written a number of elegies, and you never want to do that. But the reason to do it is to preserve the story, So poets are historians. They're cultural storytellers that are making sure that we remember who we are and how to get back to where we are when we've gotten lost. The thing I love about the love poem is you can think that you have written love poems your entire life, and you can think that they are really good until you get that really good love. And then you think, I had no idea, So the blessing of Sid's love poem is that if you don't have a love poem in your heart that's that good yet, it can still happen. So I love that one. We also talk about how we're interconnected in this way. And a fun note, Saul came last year through Poetry Promise, and I met with him, with Sid and other people, and Saul and I had the same teacher. So I studied with Tish Jones at the University of Northern Iowa, and Saul was in her last class before he came to Iowa, and I was studying to be tenure track faculty. I was working at PhD track, and I was taking Black theater history with Tish, and one day she said, Angela, you're a writer. If you can write, don't you want to write? And I had all my research. I was ready to do the thing, and I said, okay, I'll try. I'll try this. And by the end of the semester with Tish, I had saved my money and quit my job to spend an entire summer writing. So it's funny how we all come back together and that it's a calling that you spoke about today. So I want to thank you for being the first poets that we've hosted as part of the Artists at Work series. You opened it beautifully. So please join me in thanking both of the poets again. Thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions. If you have a question you would like to ask, or we also have the book signing tables, and if you would prefer to ask your question individually, is there anyone who had a question for the poets, or would you like to mingle? You do, James has one.
James.
There we go. I have. No, for some people, need the mic. Here you go.
Hey, my question is, I feel like people talk about the how a lot, like methodology or technique, and people talk about what is it about. But I was just curious what y'all thought about what it should do. On the other end, if you had a vision for what poetry does for people after it's left you, what do you think, just in general, I'm not going to be too specific, but what do you think it does to people?
Well, I can speak specifically to you. I just read your chapbook last night for inspiration. So I think poetry should inspire, it should move, it should reside with someone, it should resonate. Should, right? It may not, but I think when it's coming from an authentic place in me, it should land somewhere in you that's authentic. You may not like it, but it should definitely land in a place that's genuine. And if you genuinely dislike it, that's still genuine. If you genuinely are inspired to write a poem, which I was from you when we were in San Francisco, you wrote it for Julia. I was inspired to write Prophets and Poets because that was from a genuine place, and you didn't even know her. So that lived in me. So then I think it's kind of like wine, right? Poetry is like wine, and we're kind of like the glasses that host it. And it should continuously flow, I think.
Yeah, so I was reading your chapbook last night too. All the James groupies, all the Norm groupies were reading his chapbook last night, and it's gorgeous, and it doesn't need craft. Some people are such natural poets that it just flows out of them like water. But for me, I want to connect with people. That's why I write. And in a reading, I want to be able to see people's faces and see the emotions play on their faces and see what they're feeling when I read. And when I write on the page, I want to talk to people across space and time, because people talk to me across space and time. People talk to me from the 16th and 17th centuries and meant something to me, and that's what I want to do too. And yeah, I want to move people to action. When I'm writing about injustice, I want to move people to do something about it. But even more importantly, I just want to move them. I just want to see them feel something when I speak.
Before we ask the next audience question, I was wondering if you could tell us how you go about approaching telling a story that is not your own. And I bring this up because of the story of Henrietta Lacks, where we talk about, what does the writer do to sort of tell someone else's story?
Yeah, so my first chapbook was mostly poems about medicine. I used to be a pediatrician, and you have to be really careful when telling somebody else's story, because you don't necessarily have a chance to go ask for permission. You have to change enough names and details so that that person wouldn't necessarily recognize themselves. But it's okay to tell other people's stories. That's what writers do. There's a movement right now called Own Stories, where we want to hear from people about their own group stories, and we don't want, necessarily white people telling everybody else's stories and appropriating everything. But also, as a writer, you have to be able to imagine yourself in anybody else's shoes.
Yeah, I tend to, as a storyteller, I try, either if I don't know, I try to dig as much into what's available about them and kind of channel the essence of who that person is so that I could tell it objectively. But I wrote a screenplay called Skid Row's, and it takes place here in Vegas, and I'm going to produce it myself. And it was about a friend of mine who was a pimp, actually, in LA, and there was a young white woman that he was holding captive. And pimping her out, basically. And I know she went to buy some cigarettes, and she called, and she's like, can I go buy, some cigarettes? And she just made $500 on her back. And I'm like, what? So I happened to be in, they were squatting in mansions then, and so I was hanging out with him. And when she got there, I kind of cornered her and started talking to her, and it's her story, it's his story, but it's also my story too, because I was there watching it. And I remember talking to her like, listen, if somebody's going to pimp you, you should pimp you. Like, you wouldn't call and ask someone, can you buy a pack of cigarettes when you just made $500. So the point is I took that story, it is theirs, but it's mine too, because I was there. And so I took the story and did justice to it. But again, like you said, get permission. I think that's important.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else who has a question? Okay. Kira.
What advice do you have for people who are maybe not poets, but who are looking to expand their creative processes with writing? For example, myself, who I have a lot of thoughts and feelings and deep emotions that I feel like I can never get down in writing. And I want some advice maybe on how you engage your mind more and how you further your creativity.
I was just talking to a friend of mine who kind of asked the same question, and they have these workshops at Beyond Baroque in LA. They have really good workshops. But also there's a mindfulness meditation, right? That where you can kind of center your thoughts, right? But I think the simplest thing to writing is just writing, right? Just write, and don't care about what comes out on the page. Don't limit yourself. Don't judge yourself. I think, was it Miles Davis that said, if you didn't live it, it's not coming out your horn. But obviously you've lived something, right? So there's something ready to come out of your horn, but you got to pick up the horn and blow, right? So for us, it's poetry. It's it's paper. And there's a book called The Artist's Way. It's really good in helping you channel your thoughts. And Walter Mosley, my mentor, you know, I can be a little wayward and kind of like not focused, but he told me, you know, you need to write every day. You need to write every day. It doesn't matter what you write, but just sit down from 9 to 11 or whenever it is, and that's your writing space, right? And you might write 3 words that day, but you wrote something, you know? So just do it, right? Commit it. Don't worry about what it's going to be when it comes out. It'll tell you what it's going to be. Because some of these poems, you know, I don't know who they belong to, but I'm blessed for them to come through me, but they're pretty much already written. So all I have to do is obey, sit there, and allow, like water, for it to flow.
What's the difficulty for you in getting your thoughts down on paper?
I never feel like thank you. I just never feel like I can articulate my words how I feel. Like my thoughts and my emotions are so deep, but when they're on paper, it seems so, I don't know, just not very, you know, because I read a lot and everything, but I could just never, maybe I'm comparing myself too much or judging myself too much.
Well, the inner critic is what you're talking about. It stops you from going ahead. And I don't want to advocate substance abuse or anything, but one drink does a lot to get rid of an inner critic. So I'm trying with my own writing practice to be more daily about it, the way Sid was talking. And so yesterday I hadn't written my poem yet, so I went down to SLS Casino at Sahara in Las Vegas, and I had one drink, and then I took my phone and I walked around the casino talking into my phone. I have a voice recognition program. You probably have one on your phone. And so it all went into a written email, and you know, some of the words were not exactly what I said, because sometimes it makes up stuff, but then that could be useful too. And so then you get home and you take out this sheet of paper, and you do whatever you want with it. You can put it into an online cut-up machine, and it'll give you new phrases with the words that you picked out. But then you pick out the phrases that touch you, that move you. Maybe it's just 3 or 4 phrases of a whole page that you wrote. And then this is something the flash fiction writer Thaisa Frank told me. You maybe do a free write, like a whole page of that. You take out the 2 or 3 things that spark your imagination the most, and then you do another free write from those things. And then you take out those phrases and try to shape them into a narrative, and maybe use a form. Like, you know, for prose you wouldn't have to do this, but for poetry you might you take a 4-stanza or 3-stanza form and try to shape it in there, and that leads you in new directions. So there's all kinds of ways to play with words without actually having to like type on a typewriter or write. So those are some ideas.
Thank you.
And you're like crazy intense, right? So I saw you, right? You're absorbing everything, right? So your cup is overflowing. You just got to get out of your way, right? And you can also use words, like 1-word prompts, and just see what comes out. Like some crazy word, and just sit there with it for an hour and challenge yourself. But you have to get out of your way, because you're crazy intense, and I can't wait what comes out of you today.